Hello, everyone.
Hi, Professor.
How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Let me see. I thought I just saw someone else sign on. Okay, good. So are there any questions before I begin my monologue?
Actually, a quick question.
Yes.
So I realize this is reaching back a bit, but I remember when we started talking about a lot of these kind of challenges of enforcement of laws, how there was a lot of resistance starting out. And I'm curious where that came from initially, because it seems like that like there was resistance really before there were even really like solid attempts to pursue this stuff. And I'm curious kind of what that grew out of, or how we could see that. Or
That is a very good question. And it's one that historians have been asking, as well as since this period, but the British ministry was also asking this. Why does this happen? Why is there this resistance here? So that's actually one of the great questions to ask. And I think you would be very much interested in Bernard Bailyn's book, The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, because that is what the book is about. How does this happen? And where does this tradition of resistance come from? And so that book, published more than 50 years ago, 60, in the late 1960s, is one of the books that really transforms the way we think about this period. And then there are others. Another place to look would be Gary Nash's book, The Urban Crucible. And, Bailyn and Nash are probably among the leading scholars of this period who come at this from different angles. And I think you need to take both into account. It's a great question. It's one I hope, I should just tip you off that my tendency as a scholar is not to hit you over the head with what I think, but kind of to tell you stories that hopefully will let you see how this happened, and then expect you to do the hard work of figuring out why this happened. But that's what we're doing. So yeah, that's a great question. So I'm glad at least that question has propped up. Why did this happen? Because it is something that still puzzles us. And why does it happen at this particular time? That's another thing that puzzles us. And then, of course, there are all these contradictions within it. So I think it's a question well worth keeping in your mind. And I'm glad you asked it. I hope everyone else will now have that question in their notes. Why did this happen? Where did this resistance come from? And that is one of the essential pieces of this story. I know that didn't answer your question, other than to say it's a really good question. And it's a question I've been puzzling over for a long time. And if by the end of the semester we figured it out, maybe I can retire. But, anyway, there are lots of different explanations for it. Are there other questions? Actually, Lizette reminds me that our first paper is due next week, and much as I would like to spend the semester telling you my favorite stories about the revolution, you do have to do a certain amount of work aside from that, and that I'm not downplaying that as a chore that you all do, having to listen to me. But the first assignment is to do a primary source paper, and I did this afternoon figure out some primary sources that would be useful. One of the real downsides to this pandemic, one of many, is that you can't go to places that have primary sources like the Mass Historical Society or the Boston Public Library or even the Sawyer Library, which has some published primary sources. So we have to make do with other things. Primary sources, do we know what they are? As opposed, yes.
They were there at the time of the event.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah. So if we're looking at this particular period, that would mean people's letters to one another, people's diaries. Newspapers would count as primary sources then. You really couldn't take I suppose in 200 years, well, there very likely won't be newspapers left. And how many of you have actually read a newspaper today, that is the physical paper? A couple. Well, that's actually more than I was expecting. That's good. Good. The A students have, yes, read a newspaper today. Other A students have not. I'm always reminded of what Thomas Jefferson said about newspapers. But anyway, newspapers would count. Today they would count, I suppose, if you're looking at attitudes and so on. They're really not good guides to what exactly happened. But newspapers had a certain form then, just as they do now. So I did spend some time today, and let me just see if I'm able to access this particular screen. Maybe I'm not. Doesn't look like it. Not there. Okay. Screen sharing has stopped. Okay, we'll try this one. Just see where here we go. This looks good. So on our Blackboard site, on the discussion, well, this is the discussion board, the course content, you can see, I found stuff, and I know other people have found stuff. Lizette actually found Mercy Otis Warren's letters, which is a great source. And this just gives you a sense of some of the things available. There are links here to primary sources, not really the same thing I was looking for you to do, which is just to take someone's diary or someone's letters or a series of newspapers and go through them. This does remind me of another source I hadn't been thinking of, which I'll mention in a minute. But you do see a number of different things that are available to you. For example, the Mass Historical Society, which is the oldest historical society in the country. And it was formed in 1791 because this group of guys, and they were all guys, had all of this stuff. And they said, boy, this really would enable someone to know the history of what happened. And if it's all lost, no one will be able to do that. So why don't we save it? So they did. So they have tremendous amount of stuff. They have John Adams's live papers, all of his correspondence. Also, they have most of Thomas Jefferson's personal papers are at the Mass Historical Society. And then other things. So they really have, on this website, they've just put together what they have, the stories that you can tell with their various materials. So very useful. The Mass Historical Society also does all kinds of things. It's open to the public for free. And they have usually have meetings and things where people talk about history. It's at 1154 Boylston Street. During a normal semester, we would visit it, but this sadly is not a normal semester. So there's the Mass Historical Society. The American Revolution Institute is affiliated with the Society of the Cincinnati. And this was an organization formed by Washington's officer corps after the Revolution. And they have this beautiful headquarters in Washington, and they've just started the American Revolution Institute, which they have a lot of scholars come and talk about different aspects of the revolution. And they also have a terrific library. Here you see at least one person you know. Here's J.L. Bell. And so they have all of these videos. They also have a library with a lot of materials. So that is another place. And by the way, if you know something that I am overlooking, please let me know. The Colonial Society of Massachusetts is another of these scholarly organizations. And they are in the process of publishing the papers of Thomas Hutchinson and Francis Bernard as well, and they finished publishing the papers of Josiah Quincy. And these are all completely searchable. That is, they've published the book, but then they've made it all available on their website. So it's very easy to search this, and you can go through Bernard's papers. Hutchinson's papers are finished up to about 1769. The Quincy volumes are done. All kinds of interesting stuff here with the Colonial Society, as well as other notable things they do. Okay, let me see what else we have here. Century, this is a great site put together by the Library of Congress. This has all of the proceedings of the Continental Congress, the letters of delegates to Congress, Eliot's debate in the state ratifying conventions, Max Farren's records of the Federal Convention, and all the journals of the House of Representatives, the Senate. This James Maclay kept a journal during the first session of the Senate. You know, when I was your age, you would have to go through all these dusty libraries to try to find copies of this stuff. And you, sitting at home, have access to more materials than Henry Adams had or I had. And it really should make you a better historian. So you have no excuse for not exceeding the scholars like me who have had to search around for this. You know, you can sit at home in your pajamas doing the kind of research that some people spend years, you know, traveling to archives to do. So another great resource here. And let's see, the founders on this is another of these phenomena. These are all of the papers of John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington. All their letters, journals, etc. And, you know, you can just, it has just about everything here. Terrific resource. As I mentioned, the Mass Historical Society has the Adams family papers. And so here, this is actually the website to it at the Mass Historical Society. And okay, J.L. Bell has this blog where every day he writes some interesting thing about something that happened in Boston. 1775 is his year, but he covers other ground. So he's been doing this for quite a while, and he has a this is a phenomenal resource. Okay, the other thing I mentioned, and let me just see if I can find it while we are talking here, at the Mass Historical Society. There's a guy named Harbottle Dorr. Pops right up, okay. So Harbottle Dorr was a Boston merchant. He might have been, he was actually a shoemaker. And he read the newspapers voraciously. More than that, he annotated them. And he has these 4 volumes that he saved of these newspapers from the Revolutionary period that are annotated by Harbottle Dorr with all kinds of notes about what different people were doing. So here you can see, here's a sample page where he's putting in the margin. So you really want to get a sense of what this, you know, one of the things we're looking for, and when I was telling you, we have the papers of Madison and Jefferson and Washington, you might have been thinking, yeah, well, what about ordinary people? Where do they appear? And it's hard to find ordinary people here because a lot of times, you know, if you have to move a lot, you don't save your stuff, things do disappear. And here's Harbottle Dorr, a shoemaker. And so we can kind of trace what he thought about things by reading this newspaper. And there are other ways of getting at. That's one of the other things. James is probably going to ask me next week, what do ordinary people think? And that's one of the other things historians are trying to do. I mean, this is what Gary Nash is trying to do in The Urban Crucible. Get at what are ordinary folks thinking here? You know, kind of know what John Adams is thinking. And it's important to remember Adams wasn't Adams is someone who makes himself into a leader. He isn't someone born in the Massachusetts aristocracy. And so these are some things that should be useful to you, interesting to you. And the purpose of this assignment is really, to the primary source assignment, is really to get you to look at this through a person or through how it looked at the time. So if you're using newspapers, that's what you would do. If you're using some other kind of printed source, printed at the time, that's what you would be doing, not simply rehashing what we already know. So is this making sense to people, or should I have started over?
I have a question. Are we looking
Yes.
at a collection of like a topic, like we were picking a topic and we want to find specific
No,
papers,
no.
or just one paper?
Well, if you're looking at, say, a newspaper, read
Yeah.
through several issues, and you might not. One of the problems with finding just newspapers, I mean, the hard bottle door collections there. I'm not sure what newspapers are available through the BPL. They used to allow open access to everything. Now they've restricted it. Yep, but look through, and it might not be the main story you're looking at, but how is this newspaper, what's the news in it? Usually in a newspaper like this, like the one we kind of just briefly saw with Horror Bottle Door, the first page is usually international notes, and then there may be some ads. You get into the middle, there is more varied material, and then you get to the last page, usually there are ads and things, but it's all jumbled together. It's very compact. It's usually just 4 printed pages. And there, you're going to find all the different things. You're not going to see the big headline telling you what the big news is today. You really have to look through it. And I've had students who've written about really interesting things. I mean, the same person can look at this, 2 different people can look at the same newspaper and they'll see different things that interest them.
Like our interpretation of it?
It's, well, your interpretation is part of it, but also you really have to study it first before you can interpret it. So I'm not expecting you to find the newspaper in the day of the Boston Tea Party and write about the Tea Party.
Okay.
But what else is in the newspaper then? What is on people's minds? And it might be what's for sale, or it might be something else. I mean, you're really trying to reconstruct how people saw their world, less than just rehashing the story that we already know based on the newspapers. So you're really exploring this very different world. And the newspaper, like someone's diary or a series of letters, is one way of getting at that. What do we know about this, having read this newspaper? You know, and it might be that the event we know is the big event of the time doesn't appear. Well, you know, why not? What does appear? That's really the purpose of this. You know, so I really leave it up to you what you find. I mean, maybe if I had thought about this more, I would have sent you all the same documents, and then you could have read them, and you would have found something. Everyone would find things differently because everyone is interested in different things and interprets things in somewhat different ways. But this is something historians do. I'm probably making this less clear as I go along, but history is less clear as we go along. We're always being puzzled by it and always asking these questions. If we weren't, there would be no point in studying it. You know, if I were able to give an answer to James as to why all this resistance happened, I probably would have hung it up a long time ago, because that's really the big question. There are other big questions too. The main question historians ask is, so what? You know, what you're doing now with this primary source assignment is starting to dig into these sources. You'll find all kinds of different things, but then the question is, well, so what? And that's really what you are doing. You're figuring that out. Any other questions before I become too philosophical and just, yes, Lizette, were you raising your hand?
Yeah, sorry. So I know that we're writing these about whatever primary sources that we're supposed to find ourselves, but are we allowed to use secondary sources to add like context around it, like some of the readings that you've given us?
Yeah, well, yeah, if you think, yeah, that helps, yes. I mean, that's ideal, but it's not essential. Yeah. So you found Mercy Otis Warren's papers?
Yeah, I found them from the Massachusetts Historical Society.
Very good, good. I was going to put up a link to that, but I didn't want to tip other people off as to where the really good stuff was. So I'll save that for you.
No, the reason I asked was because we have one of the books from our class that mentioned her, which is how I went to
Yeah.
look for her. So I was wondering if I could use that
Oh yeah,
to
definitely.
add context about like the plays that she wrote, so it would be a
Mhm.
better like.
Okay, sure. Yeah, that's fine. It is really what we're doing is discovering something, okay, and that's use whatever information you can to give more context, but it's not essential. So, okay, other questions on this? Okay, so good. I'm sure you'll enjoy doing this exploration, and I will learn things from what you do. Okay. Well, let's see. Last time, I think I left off with the aftermath of the destruction of the tea, and Parliament suspends the government of Massachusetts, closes the port of Boston, puts General Thomas Gage in charge as the governor in Massachusetts, suspends the assembly, and he is going to have a council that he will appoint, a mandamus council. That is, the town meetings won't happen. The governor will appoint the sheriffs, the magistrates, and so on. And the port's going, and also a few regiments of troops come to Boston just as a show of force. And General Gage arrives at the end of May, and he's actually welcome because remember, people really hated poor Thomas Hutchinson. We're glad to get rid of him, so they think Gage is going to be an improvement. So one Boston tradesman wrote in his diary about the bad governor left. That is Governor Hutchinson. And now there's expectations maybe the new governor will be better. And, Gage is trying to conciliate these people. He arrives, as I said, the end of May. The port of Boston is closed on June 1st. By this time, it's filled with military ships. And Boston is once again occupied by British troops, a much bigger military force here. And it is unclear how all of this is going to play out. Also, Gage does call the assembly to meet not in Boston, but in Salem. He is going to suspend the assembly, but the assembly elected in April. Every April there are elections at the town meetings. So this assembly convenes in April, and Gage suspends it. He sends the secretary of the province, and Oliver is no longer the secretary. Now the secretary is a guy named Thomas Flucker, and Flucker is he goes to the assembly to tell them that the governor has suspended the assembly, and the assembly locks the door, so Flucker can't get in. He winds up not nailing the proclamation to the door. And while he is doing this, the members of the assembly are choosing delegates to a Continental Congress. That is, they want to have a meeting of delegates from all of the colonies to talk about what they can do in the face of this big emergency. And they choose as delegates Samuel Adams and John Hancock and Robert Treat Paine and Elbridge Gerry. And then, of course, the assembly has been suspended, and these guys start preparing for the Congress. And other colonies are also sending delegates to this Congress. It's going to meet in Philadelphia because Philadelphia is centrally located and also the biggest city in British North America. And Philadelphia is the second busiest port in the British Empire. And what the Massachusetts guys want to make sure is that this isn't just seen as a Massachusetts rebellion, because the feeling in England is that the people in Massachusetts are a bunch of religious fanatics. You can't really control them. The people in the other colonies, the thinking is, aren't quite as wacky as these guys from New England. Plus, I should tell you, the people in the other colonies really don't like the people in New England that much, because they are a bunch of religious fanatics. They're seen as religious fanatics. Also, they're seen as kind of sharp traders who are always looking out for their own advantage, while they're also, I think I might have talked about this last time, this perception of people from Massachusetts as being sharp dealers and not really interested in the common good, but interested in their own good. So, and you can also imagine, with the port of Boston being closed, the Massachusetts government being shut down, perhaps the other colonies would have good reason for not jumping on to the bandwagon of Massachusetts. Because if the British government's going to shut down Boston, why wouldn't they shut down Philadelphia or New York or Charleston or one of these other ports if they step out of line? So you can see what a difficult thing this will be to negotiate for these guys from New England. Why would they? And this is also something the British government understands. There isn't a whole lot that keeps these different colonies together. They're not saying, oh yeah, we're all Americans. No, people in Georgia are from Georgia, people from New England are from New England. And remember, in 1773, one of the big things that Governor Hutchinson had accomplished, and again, this is one of the incidences of what would be the big news in 1773. Hutchinson thought the big news was he had resolved the long-running border dispute with New York. New York and Massachusetts had been on the verge of war over their border. And New York and New York City and Boston had been competing for trade for a long time. There's that long animosity. And another example of this is people from Connecticut. Connecticut, remember, claimed everything to the Pacific Ocean or the South Sea. And people from Connecticut in the 1740s had gone off to the west, set up towns in what was considered by Pennsylvania to be part of Pennsylvania. They went there, they bought land from the Delaware Indians and set up towns in what was called the Wyoming Valley, the upper valley of the Susquehanna River. So you have these Connecticut towns set up in Pennsylvania. They send delegates to the Hartford General Court. They pay taxes to Connecticut, not to Pennsylvania. You can imagine this is valuable land, and Pennsylvania would like to sell it to people in Pennsylvania. So you have that kind of tension. There was also a long-running border dispute between Pennsylvania and Maryland, and tension between Maryland and Virginia. Virginia also claims the Ohio River. And there's that fort that I think I mentioned at the junction of the Allegheny and Monongahela River, where it forms the Ohio, had been built by people from Virginia in what Pennsylvania claims is part of Pennsylvania. So you have this real fragmentation, a real disagreement among these colonies. So what is going to hold them together? And the British government doesn't really think anything will. And the worst thing, of course, is you have these religious fanatics from New England who now have pushed things too far and have brought on this, having the port shut down, the government suspended. There's a good chance people in the other colonies will say, high time for that. Someone should have clamped down on them long ago. So this is really one of the big problems, as you can see, as we're preparing for this Congress. And I'll talk a bit about the Congress because it is an important event. It's unclear how it is going to go. John Adams is spending the summer of 1774, I said, preparing for the Congress. He's actually trying to earn money as a lawyer, which means he's traveling around the province hearing cases. And in his diary, he writes about this, and he's in Danvers on his way to Ipswich. And then he hears about this Congress. He says, there's a new and a grand scene open before me, a Congress. This will be an assembly of the wisest men upon the continent, who are Americans in principle, i.e. against the taxation of Americans by authority of Parliament. I feel myself to be unequal to the business. A more extensive knowledge of the realm of the colonies and of commerce, as well as of law and policy, is necessary than I am master of. What can be done? Will it be expedient to propose an annual Congress of Committees? By the way, Congress at this time meant a meeting. It didn't mean a body that has any legislative power. It's just a meeting of like-minded folks. So there is an assembly that makes laws in a province, but a Congress is just a meeting. It's like a trade union meeting. They still call it the Congress of Industrial Organizations, as a general meeting of all these unions. or it's a convention in the sense of a business convention. You know, all the college professors get together, or all the stockbrokers get together, or the Shriners get together. That's a Congress. You don't really expect it to accomplish anything. In fact, if you know most of these conventions, you know it's actually the opposite. Will it be expedient to propose an annual Congress of committees to petition? Will it do to petition at all? To the king, or to the lords, or to the commons? What will such consultations avail? Deliberations alone will not do. We must petition or recommend to the assemblies to petition, or the ideas of the people are as various as their faces. One thinks, no more petitions, former having been neglected and despised. Some are for resolves, spirited resolves, and some are for bolder counsel. So he's unsure what's going to happen at this, because you have all of these different possibilities, but none really seems like it's going to do anything. And then for Adams, this is the first time he leaves New England. And you get a sense from reading his journal, as well as what other people are writing, how strange this gathering is, because they really are meeting people who seem to be from different worlds. And they're going to places that very much seem to be different worlds. New York, for example, Adams writes, the streets of this town are more regular and elegant than those in Boston. The houses are more grand as well as neat. They are almost all painted, brick buildings and all. Mr. McDougall gave a caution to avoid every expression here which looked like an allusion to the last appeal. So McDougall is a New York politician, and he's warning them about the sentiments in New York are not as they are in New England. This is after Adams is struck by the grandeur of this town with the painted brick houses. He says there's a powerful party here who are intimidated by fears of a civil war. They've been induced to acquiesce by assurances that there was no danger and that a peaceful cessation of commerce would effect relief. So one thing McDougall is telling some people in New York is, we're not going to have a war, but if we simply cut off trade with England, that's going to solve things. Otherwise, these people say, hey, we don't want to have any part of something that might lead to a civil war. Another party, he says, are intimidated lest the leveling spirit of the New England colonies should propagate itself into New York. The leveling spirit. You know, in New York, there are a lot of people who are getting quite rich through trade, and there is a bigger class differential in New York than there is in New England. And it's thought that these New England Puritans have this leveling spirit. Another party are prompted by Episcopalian prejudices against New England. That is, Episcopalian prejudices. The dean has told me not to ask people what their religious background is, but you know, these are the Anglicans, and they don't like the New England Puritans, so they fear the New Englanders having too much power. Another party are merchants, largely concerned in navigation, and therefore afraid of non-importation, non-consumption, and non-exportation agreements. Another party are those who are looking up to the government for favors. So you have in New York all these different shades of opinion, and you have to really be careful what you say. I mean, something you could say in Boston, and people would stand up and cheer. You say that in New York, and 9/10 of the people in the audience are going to say you're crazy, or you're going to bring on a civil war. So you can see how difficult this is going to be. And it's also, you can also see why we are not beginning the story with the revolution in New York, because New York is a much different place. He says, went to the coffee house and saw the Virginia paper. So a newspaper came from Virginia, and the Virginia Assembly, the House of Burgesses, had drawn up a series of resolutions, which are then published in the newspaper. What the newspaper, and these are calling for supporting Boston in its hour of extremity. And these are the resolutions introduced by Patrick Henry, who gave one of his ringing speeches about them, which, you know, I'm sure has anyone memorized any of Patrick Henry's speeches? Yeah, I'm not going to ask you to recite all of it if you have, so don't. So if you can safely raise your hand. Yeah, Sean, you know something about Patrick Henry's speeches?
Is that the give me liberty, give me death guy?
Yeah, he is the give me liberty or give me death guy. Caesar had his Brutus, Charles the First had his Cromwell, and George the Third, he said, and people started saying, treason, treason. He said, if this be treason, make the most of it. The give me liberty, give me death comes about a little bit later. But yeah, he's a great orator. Interesting story. Oh, well, Henry, if we were having this class in Virginia, we would talk more about Patrick Henry and his role in this. Great orator and spellbinding orator, in fact. And so, yeah, his resolutions published in the newspaper, and Adams and the others read this and say, boy, this is great. What they don't know is that the assembly had rescinded them. They published them, but then they said, well, we don't actually go quite along with that, but they're published in the newspaper so other people can think that Virginia is doing this. And then Adams writes about what's going on in the few days there in New York. The way we have been in of breakfasting, dining, drinking coffee about the city is very disagreeable on some accounts. Although it introduces us to the acquaintance of many respectable people here, yet it hinders us from seeing the college, the churches, the printers' offices and booksellers' shops, and many other things which we should choose to see. So all of his time spent in New York is spent talking to these other guys, breakfasting, having coffee with them, eating with them, and he'd like to go see the college and go see these other things. With all the opulence and splendor of this city, there is very little good breeding to be found. We've been treated with an assiduous respect, but I have not seen one real gentleman, one well-bred man since I came to town. At their entertainments, there is no conversation that is agreeable. There's no modesty, no attention to one another. They talk very loud, very fast, and all together. If they ask you a question, before you can utter 3 words of your answer, they break out upon you again and talk away. So New Yorkers really are different. They're noisy, they're talkative, they don't really listen, and no good breeding here. And so from New York, they set out across New Jersey and arrive in Philadelphia, which, as I think I mentioned, is the largest city in British North America. And it's very different from Boston in a lot of ways. And Adams will have a lot to say, not only about Philadelphia, but about the people he meets. Let me just give you probably one of the favorite paragraphs of his visit to Philadelphia. Philadelphia, with all of its trade and wealth and regularity, is not Boston. The morals of our people are much better. Their manners are more polite and agreeable. They are purer English. Our language is better. Our persons are handsomer. Our spirit is greater. Our laws are wiser. Our religion is superior. Our education is better. We exceed them in everything, but in a market and in charitable public foundations. You can see why he's going to find it difficult. And we'll get to this. Adams in Philadelphia has an opportunity to do things he could not do in Boston. And he spends much of his time visiting the different churches in Philadelphia. So on their first Sunday, he goes to the Presbyterian meeting and hears a Mr. Sprout in the forenoon. And there is not a Presbyterian church in Boston. There are congregational churches and there are Anglican churches. Grudgingly, there are Anglican churches, but no Presbyterian. So Adams is kind of curious, what goes on in a Presbyterian church? And here the Reverend Sprout uses no notes, don't appear to have any, opens his Bible and talks away. Not a very numerous nor very polite assembly. Then in the afternoon, he goes to Christ Church, the largest Anglican church in Philadelphia, and he heard Mr. Coombs. This is a more noble building and a genteeler congregation. The organ and a new choir of singers were very musical. Mr. Coombs is celebrated here as a fine speaker. He is sprightly, has a great deal of action, speaks distinctly, but I confess I am not charmed with his oratory. His style was indifferent, his method confused. In one word, his composition was vastly inferior to the ordinary sermons of our Howe, Hunt, Chauncey, Cooper, Eliot, and even Stillman. Mr. Mifflin spent the Sunday evening with us at our lodgings. And then Adams every Sunday is going to go to at least 2 different churches to hear the ministers preach. And then he meets some of the other members of Congress, people he might have corresponded with, or people whose names he might have known, who come from these far-flung parts of British North America. One is Edward Rutledge from South Carolina. Young Rutledge told me he studied 3 years at the Temple. The Temple is where lawyers in London are trained and is the center of the British legal world. And the Temple bar sits across the street, and after you have finished your studies at the Temple, the young barristers process along the Strand and they pass the Temple bar. And this is where the phrase passing the bar comes from. He told me he studied 3 years at the Temple. He thinks this a great distinction. Says he took a volume of notes which Josiah Quincy transcribed. Says that young gentlemen ought to travel early because that freedom and ease of behavior, which is so necessary, cannot be acquired but early in life. This Rutledge is young, sprightly, but not deep. He has the most indistinct, inarticulate way of speaking. Speaks through his nose, a wretched speaker in conversation. How he will shine in public, I don't know. He seems good-natured, though conceited. Caesar Rodney from Delaware is the oddest-looking man in the world. He is tall, thin, slender as a reed, pale, his face not bigger than a large apple. Yet there is sense, fire, spirit, wit, and humor in his countenance. And it goes on. On the 8th of September, they actually get news that in New England, first they hear a rumor that General Gage has gone on the attack, and actually blood had been shed in Boston. Then it turns out that hadn't exactly happened. Something else had. One of the things Gage knew, and I'll just talk a little bit about this for a moment or two, is that Gage knew that the colonists were stockpiling weapons, and he wanted to disarm them so that they wouldn't, it's more likely that there is going to be an armed conflict if each side is armed. If one side isn't armed, it's less likely they're going to start a conflict. That's certainly one way of looking at it. And that was Gage's idea. Knowing that the towns were stockpiling ammunition and gunpowder, and they did this in powder houses. And there are still a few powder houses around, stone buildings. In fact, the very one I'll be talking about still stands in somewhere on the borderland between Somerville and Medford. At this time, it was in Charlestown. And the powder house is where the Charlestown militia was stockpiling its ammunition. And Gage sent a military group actually to get the weapons out, which they did. The rumor of this happening, and then a rumor spreads that in taking the weapons, Gage had also killed a number of members of the militia. The next day, several thousand people assemble at Harvard Square, preparing to march into Boston and take care of Gage. Cooler heads prevail. They don't march into Boston, but they do go down to Brattle Street, where a fellow named Oliver, and yet another Oliver, was living, and he had taken a position on the governor's council. He had accepted an appointment. The mob goes and destroys his house. And the other folks along Brattle Street who want to remain loyal to the British Crown realize the only way they can stay safe is to leave Cambridge and go into Boston, where they will be under the protection of General Gage. So we see beginning to happen here in the fall of 1774 are events like this, where Gage, in trying to disarm the citizenry, winds up provoking a mob to go and attack people who want to remain loyal, want Gage to be able to carry out his duties as governor of Massachusetts. So that's what's happening while Adams and the others are off in Philadelphia. Okay, and let's see. One of the people who really probably the most notable person they are going to meet in their minds before they reach Philadelphia is John Dickinson. And in the 1767-68, during the whole attempt by the British government to tax commerce, Dickinson, who was a lawyer in Philadelphia, wrote a series of letters explaining why the British Parliament did not have the power to tax the Americans. And Dickinson was a very smart man, and he knew if he wrote a pamphlet arguing as a Philadelphia lawyer, saying why a Philadelphia lawyer thinks I shouldn't have to pay taxes that Parliament imposes, Philadelphia lawyers then and now were not held in very high esteem. So he writes these as from the farmer, from a Pennsylvania farmer. And this book is called The Farmer's Letters. Farmers, it was thought, were honest, virtuous people, not simply looking out for their own best interest. So Dickinson's Farmer's Letters were really the big book of the time for those who were thinking politically. So meeting Dickinson is quite a big deal. And Adams and his party do go meet Mr. Dickinson and his lady at his seat at Fair Hill. And Mrs. Thompson, Miss Norris, Miss Harrison. Mr. Dickinson has a fine seat, and by that he means his estate. A beautiful prospect of the city, the river and the country, fine gardens, and a very grand library. The most of his books were collected by Mr. Norris, once Speaker of the House here, father of Mrs. Dickinson. So he's a Philadelphia lawyer. His wife's father was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and he has this beautiful estate overlooking the Delaware River and the city of Philadelphia. Mr. Dickinson is a very modest man and very ingenious, as well as agreeable. He has an excellent heart, and the cause of his country lies near it. He is full and clear for allowing to Parliament the regulation of trade upon principles of necessity and the mutual interest of both countries. In the Farmer's Letters, Dickinson makes clear that Parliament does have the power to regulate trade, but not to tax the Americans. It's kind of a fine distinction he's making. Then he goes to visit Mr. Gadsden and Mr. Dean. Gadsden is from South Carolina. Dean is from Connecticut. At their lodgings, Gadsden is violent against allowing Parliament any power of regulating trade or allowing that they have anything to do with us. Power of regulating trade, he says, is a power of ruining us, as bad as acknowledging them as supreme legislative in all cases whatsoever. So you have Dickinson saying, yes, Parliament should be able to regulate trade, and Gadsden saying, absolutely not, that would be terrible. And while all of this is happening, that is, Adams is making these observations, here in New England, in fact, with the town meeting suspended and with Boston occupied, Suffolk County calls for a convention. And Boston is the county seat for Suffolk County. At this time, Suffolk County extended into Milton and Dedham, and the Suffolk County Convention met in Milton and adopted a series of resolutions written by Joseph Warren from Roxbury. And the Suffolk resolves adopted in the early September deny Parliament's power to tax and call for non-importation, boycotts of British goods, and other things as a way of pressuring Parliament to back off. And the Suffolk resolves are like those Virginia resolves I mentioned, a very strong argument against parliamentary power. And Paul Revere brings the resolves to Philadelphia, and on the 17th of September, the Congress adopts these. Adams really was quite surprised that the other members of this Congress go along with Massachusetts in this, as they decide they are going to stand with Massachusetts. And he says in his diary on the 17th of September, "This was one of the happiest days of my life. In Congress, we had generous, noble sentiments and manly eloquence. This day convinced me that America will support Massachusetts or perish with her." A couple of days later, he goes to a dinner party, and Mr. Dickinson, he said, was very agreeable. A question was started, though, about the conduct of the Boston merchants since 1770 in importing tea and paying the duty. Mr. Hancock, it is said, has received the freight of many chests of tea. I think the Boston merchants are not wholly justifiable, yet their conduct has been exaggerated. So other people from the other colonies are saying, hey, wait a minute, aren't Boston merchants importing tea and selling it? And Adams has to say, well, yeah, some are. And they're saying, isn't Hancock doing it? And says, well, he doesn't really think Hancock is. Mr. Hancock, I believe, is justifiable, but I am not certain whether he is strictly so. He owned a ship in partnership with George Haley, who has agreed here to be a ministerial man, and I suppose sent the tea in the ship. So yeah, Hancock himself isn't doing this, but he's in partnership with people who are. This is one of the reasons why some of these other guys are skeptical of the New Englanders. And Adams takes a walk with Chief Justice William Allen, the Chief Justice of Pennsylvania, as well as all the gentlemen from North Carolina, and Mr. Hamilton, the late governor, and Andrew Allen, the Attorney General. We had much conversation about Mr. Franklin. Franklin is off in London at this time. Remember, he had been utterly humiliated by the Privy Council, and here they're talking about Franklin in Philadelphia. And I have to tell you, William Allen and Benjamin Franklin really detest each other. In fact, William Allen absolutely hates Benjamin Franklin for a variety of reasons we don't need to get into here. So I can imagine they're having this very droll conversation about Franklin, and Allen hates Franklin with real venom. Dined with Mr. Charles Thompson, with only Mr. Dickinson, his lady, niece in company. A most delightful afternoon we had. Mr. Dickinson gave us his thoughts and correspondence very, very freely. Then that evening he goes to the Quaker meeting. And then on Sunday, the 9th of October, went to hear Dr. Allison, an aged gentleman. It was Sacrament Day. Francis Allison was a minister in Philadelphia, and to the best of my knowledge, no relation to your esteemed professor. Although Adams says, this Dr. Allison is a man of abilities and worth, but I hear no preachers here like ours in Boston, except Mr. Duché. Combs is a good speaker, but not an original. And then in the afternoon, this is after hearing Dr. Allison in the morning, went to the Romish chapel and heard a good discourse upon the duty of parents to their children. What do you suppose a Romish chapel is?
Is that Catholic?
It's a Catholic church. It's the only one in these British colonies. And in fact, it is the only place, one of the few places in the British Empire where it's legal to have a Catholic church, because the Penns own Pennsylvania. It's not a crown colony, it is a family colony. So there is a Catholic church in Philadelphia. And this is something Adams never could have imagined going into, that he would ever see a Catholic church. Remember, the New England Puritans absolutely hated Catholicism, knowing very little about it. But here he hears a good discourse on the duty of parents to their children. The scenery and the music is so calculated to take in mankind that I wonder the Reformation ever succeeded. The paintings, the bells, the candles, the gold and the silver, these are all things you would not see or hear in a New England congregational church. You wouldn't have scenery, paintings, music. Our Savior on the cross, over the altar, at full length, all his wounds a bleeding. The chanting is exquisitely soft and sweet. It's a sensual reaction Adams has to this. So he wonders the Reformation ever succeeded with the beauty of this Catholic Mass that he sees. And then he has more to say about Congress. This is a brief respite, going to hear Dr. Allison and the Catholic priest at St. Joseph's Church. The deliberations of Congress are spun out to an immeasurable length. So much wit, sense, learning, acuteness, subtlety, eloquence, and among 50 gentlemen, each of whom has been habituated to lead and guide in his own province, that an immensity of time is spent unnecessarily. Johnson of Maryland has a clear and cool head, an extensive knowledge of trade as well as law. He's a deliberating man, but not a shining orator. His passions and imagination don't appear for an orator. Galloway, Duane, Johnson are sensible and learned, but cold speakers. Lee, Henry, and Hooper, the orators. Pack is a deliberator. Chase speaks warmly. Mifflin is a sprightly and spirited speaker. John Rutledge don't exceed in learning or oratory, though he's a rapid speaker. Young Edward Rutledge is young and zealous, a little unsteady and injudicious, but very unnatural and affected as a speaker. Dyer and Sherman speak often and long, but very heavily and clumsily. So it's a, and then spent an evening with Mr. Henry at his lodgings, consulting about a petition to the king. Henry said he had no public education. At 15, he read Virgil and Livy, has not looked into a Latin book since. His father left him at that age. He's been struggling through life ever since. He has high notions, talks about exalted minds, etc., has a hard opinion of Galloway, Jay, and the Rutledges. Their system, he says, would ruin the cause of America. He is very impatient to see such fellows and be not at liberty to describe them in their true colors. Now, things do seem to be going along well for Adams and for Massachusetts in this. You have some allies you have found, Henry and so on, but then someone else from Massachusetts had also come to the Congress, and that was not an invited guest. Let me just see if I can share any of this with you. Maybe not. Here we go. Isaac Backus also came to Philadelphia. He was from Middleborough, Massachusetts, and Isaac Backus was a Baptist minister. And in 1773, he wrote this pamphlet, Government and Liberty Described and Ecclesiastical Tyranny Exposed. And what Backus wanted to know, his congregation in Middleborough, they're Baptists. They have to pay taxes to support the Congregational Church in Middleborough. The Massachusetts Assembly, the group which had sent the Adamses and Payne and Hancock to the Congress, are taxing them to support a church they don't belong to. And Backus wants to know if this is not taxation without representation. What do you think? Should a Baptist in Middleborough have to pay taxes to support the congregational minister in Middleborough?
I suppose it would depend on whether the Congregational Church was considered a government institution.
Well, it is. I mean, according to the law, each town is formed around a parish, and everyone in the town pays taxes to support the church. And the church does have the minister sometimes will also be a teacher. In fact, it's town law about how much the minister gets paid. You pay taxes to support the minister. No one pays taxes to support the Reverend Backus. And he is not saying, I think people should be taxed to support me. He's saying, how come my congregation has to pay taxes to support a church that they don't go to? Plus, they also have to, they voluntarily pay to support the Baptist church. And he asks, and he doesn't go and talk to Hancock and the Adamses. He goes and talks to the president of Congress, who's from Virginia, and other members of Congress. I say, you know what these guys are doing in Massachusetts? They are taxing us to support the Congregational Church. This is what I meant by New Englanders being seen as religious fanatics. There aren't that many Congregationalists outside of New England. Each colony, except Pennsylvania and Rhode Island, has an established church. One reason there are so many different churches in Pennsylvania is they're all supported by voluntary donations. But in New England, each province, each town has its church. So yes, these are government institutions. And he does ask these guys, and when the leaders of Congress call in these guys from Massachusetts to say, what's going on here? Here we have this perfectly nice guy who comes and tells us that you're taxing him without representing him. Robert Treat Paine, who might have known Backus before, since he's from Taunton, which is near to Middleborough, says, it's really not a matter of principle with these Baptists. They just don't want to have to pay taxes. And Backus says, that's exactly what the British Parliament says about you, that it's not a matter of principle, you just don't want to have to pay taxes. And Backus says, how would it be if you had to pay taxes to support King's Chapel in Boston? And Paine says, well, that wouldn't work because we don't go to King's Chapel in Boston. And Backus says, well, exactly, we don't go to the Congregational Church in Middleborough. So you can see why these Massachusetts guys are going to have a hard time bringing the other colonies along with them, because they have this fundamental idea about, well, you need an established church in order to uphold morality and do these other beneficial things. And Backus is saying, actually, you don't need an established church. What he's arguing for is not to tax people to support churches they don't go to. And they really further show the Massachusetts guys where they stand by inviting Backus to deliver a sermon to the Congress. Every morning they open with a prayer, and Backus is invited to lead them in prayers. Here he's come to show up these guys from New England, and they are being shown up by him. This is really a difficult moment for these guys from Massachusetts. And what Congress does is tells them, when you get back to Massachusetts, you really should do something so you're not taxing Backus and the Baptists to support the Congregational Church. And the only one of the delegation who takes it all seriously is John Adams. But every member of the Massachusetts Assembly is a Congregationalist. They have no reason for dispensing with taxing the Baptists to support the Congregational Church. And what happens is this. No, the Congress, or these guys from Massachusetts, tell Backus, okay, when you get back to Boston, take this up with the Assembly. Now remember, General Gage had suspended the Assembly. The towns kept electing delegates to the Assembly, and in early 1775, the members of the Assembly meet in Watertown. Or in Concord first. They don't meet as members of the Assembly because the Assembly's been suspended. So they say, we're the Provincial Congress, called here because there's this emergency with it being in dispute who is in charge in Massachusetts. There's General Gage, who is in Boston with the troops, and he has the commission from the king to govern, but we are the Provincial Congress that is meeting in the absence of a duly appointed governor. So Backus presents himself to the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, and he says, the Continental Congress told me to come and talk to you about getting the tax burden lifted from the Baptists. And they say, no, hold on a minute. He said, they said, go talk to the Provincial Assembly. Well, we're not the Provincial Assembly. We're the Congress. So it takes, Massachusetts finally disestablishes the Congregational Church in 1820. The role of the Baptists in the Revolution is going to be very interesting because there aren't that many Baptists in Massachusetts, but there are enough. And in Virginia, the Baptists are going to hold the balance of power. But that's something to talk about some other day when we get back to this. But suffice it to say, the arrival of Reverend Backus is yet another thing that discomfits these New Englanders. And in fact, later on, a week or two later, Adams does go to the Baptist church in Philadelphia, and he hears a trans-Alleghenian, a preacher from the back parts of Virginia. See, I mentioned the dean doesn't want me to ask you about your religious orientations, but the Baptists come out of it's a somewhat different, they come out of the Congregational tradition, And this, is anyone a Baptist? I'm not going to start grilling you on doctrine. I just want to know if anyone can explain it more clearly than I can. Okay, good. So the Baptists essentially don't believe that infants should be baptized. You should be baptized when you are an adult and are able to understand what it is you're being baptized into, which is why they practice a full immersion baptism. And they have other parts of their doctrine. Probably the most essential is that in the eyes of God, this is actually a scriptural thing, there is neither slave nor free, Jew nor Greek, that all are equal in the eyes of God. And the Baptists rebelled against the very rather hierarchical religious traditions that had developed since the time of Christianity's dawn. You know, in most of these, in New England, each pew was purchased, and the more expensive ones are closer to the pulpit. If you were a servant, or if you don't own, you'll be up in the balcony watching the people who are able to afford the better seats down on the floor. And also the tradition is you dress up to go to the meeting. And in fact, you're also required by law in most of these places to go to the Sunday meeting. And in Virginia, the Anglican Church, which is established there, is very hierarchical, and they're again required by law to attend. And the Baptists are arrested if they don't attend. There's one case in Orange County, Virginia in 1772, a Baptist preacher out in the woods with his congregation leading them in a psalm, and the Anglican minister shows up and starts horsewhipping the Baptist. And then the sheriff shows up and he arrests the Baptist for not being in the meeting. So you have this attack on the Baptists, and the Baptists also, all souls are equal in the eyes of God. So a Baptist congregation will be black and white. Sometimes there will be a black preacher with a mixed congregation, sometimes a white preacher. Race isn't the important thing, status isn't the important thing, it is the soul that is important. And the central ritual in the Christian tradition is taking communion. And in the Anglican tradition, you will line up and you then will kneel at the communion rail. And this is a very orderly thing. And of course, the better people are there in front. And the Baptists thinking, you know, these people are dressing up. They're showing off. Who are they showing off to? Because God sees through this. And what the Baptists will do, they're forced to go into the Anglican Church and participate in this ritual when they get to the communion rail to drive home the point that we all stand naked in the eyes of God. They'll throw off their clothes, so they do stand naked in the eyes of God as well as in the eyes of these astonished Episcopalians. So you have the Baptists are really a disruptive force here. And here they are, here is the Reverend Backus coming to Congress, and a few days after this, Adams goes to the Baptist church and he hears a trans-Alleghenian, that is a guy from the other side of the mountains, a preacher from the back parts of Virginia. He preached an hour and a half, no learning, no grace of action or utterance, but an honest zeal. He told us several good stories. One was that he was once preaching in Virginia, and that those ministers who taught the people that salvation was to be obtained by good works or obedience were leading them to ruin. The next day, he was apprehended by a warrant from a magistrate for reviling the clergy of the Church of England. So he's telling them, you go to these established churches, they're leading you to ruin, and so they bring him into court for having defamed the clergy. He asked for a prayer book, turned it to the 18th or 20th article, where the same sentiment is strongly expressed. He read it to the magistrate. The magistrate, as soon as he heard it, dashed the warrant out of his hands and said, "Sir, you're discharged." So the Baptists are troublemakers. And in the evening, he goes to a Methodist meeting and he hears an old soldier named Webb, who came to America as a quartermaster under General Braddock. One of the most fluent, eloquent men I ever heard. He reaches the imagination and touches the passions very well and expresses himself with great propriety. The singing here is very sweet and soft indeed. The first music I have heard in any society, except the Moravians, and once at church with the organ. So Congress has decided it's going to support Massachusetts. It sends a petition to the Crown, asking the British Crown to hold off, to call back Parliament, restrain Parliament from invading their liberties. And they do pray a lot in the Congress. And then the Congress breaks up at the end of October. And Adams wrote in his diary that we took our departure in a very great rain from the happy, the peaceful, the elegant, the hospitable, and polite city of Philadelphia. It is not very likely I shall ever see this part of the world again, but I shall ever retain a most grateful, pleasing sense of the many civilities I have received in it, and shall think myself happy to have an opportunity of returning them. So they go off back to New England. The other delegates go back to their homes to await the king's response to their petition. And while they are doing this, there's also an election going on for Parliament. And part of the thinking is if the Whigs can win these elections, then they will change British policy. So in London, Benjamin Franklin and Josiah Quincy are meeting with members of Parliament, hoping that they can get a majority and oust Lord North as Prime Minister. But that doesn't happen. And so there's waiting over this winter. In New England, the provincial Congress continues to stockpile weapons. They spirit 4 cannon out of Boston, 4 cannon that had been sitting on the North Battery, not seeing much use. And they're actually taken out of town the British have now set up sentry points at Boston Neck. How do you get these 4 cannon past the British sentries? Well, one thing that happens in every major city is people do have outhouses or privies, and there are farmers who will come into the city, usually at night, and this happens in really every place in the world, and they shovel out the privies. And then they carry the waste out to their farms and use it as fertilizer. One thing, if you were a British sentry, you really don't want to inspect too closely is a wagon filled with what was then called night soil. I know there are other words for it, which I am not going to use. And so these 4 brass cannon are concealed in a wagon filled with night soil, gets past the sentry point, and the next day the British realize they are missing and that they're somewhere out there, along with other weapons being stockpiled. And in February, General Gage sends an expedition up to Salem. We know that there are weapons being held up in Salem, and this one arrives on a Sunday when the meeting is taking place. And I think that's about all that we have time for. I could go on for the rest of the night talking about this, but I know you all have lives to get back to. So when we come back, we'll talk about what happens in February of 1775 when General Gage sends an expedition up to Salem, and what happens with those 4 cannon once they are cleaned up with the night soil, and what goes on in the spring of 1775 in Massachusetts. And by that, okay, any questions?
I was wondering this earlier when you were talking about powder rooms, but does that have to, is that why bathrooms are sometimes called powder rooms now, or does that have to do?
No, a powder house is where you would keep gunpowder, and that would be much different from a powder room. It's called, they're called powder rooms because ladies would go there to powder their noses.
Yeah, that's what I always thought, but then when you were
no.
talking about using the outhouse, I was wondering if...
No, that would be a little too genteel. There are some things we don't use the same words in one company as in another. So there are certain bodily functions that we don't like to think of other people having. So powdering your nose is something more refined than saying we don't inquire too much more when you say you need to go powder your nose. You get the picture. Thank you for asking. And let me see, I can think of more euphemisms for all of this if you'd like, but I'm sure you have your own. Okay. Any other questions, thoughts, embarrassing bodily things you want me to try to get me to talk about so you can tell the dean? No. Okay, so I'll see you all on Wednesday.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.
Thank you, Professor.
Take care.